In this video, we will be covering some of the strangest, most horrific, most disturbing unsolved mysteries that range from random violent attacks, serial killers, unsolved missing persons cases, also massive heists, strange historical and archaeological finds, and much more. We will cover all of these and more. There is a lot in this video. So as always, grab a drink. My choice today is just plain English tea. And join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries iceberg. But just a quick note, this video doesn't have a sponsor. Although if you do like the designs on these mugs, or actually even on this cap, I'll let you read it there if you like. These are all completely original official merch that you can find in the description down below, and all the proceeds from these sales go to buying new lights for the set, to stocking up on the essentials that I need to live, so tea bags, milk. They basically just help support the channel and make these videos better. So for all of you who have already supported the channel, thank you so much. And if you would like to pick up your very own mug, cap, t-shirt, hoodie, mouse mat, stickers, whatever, you can find all of that in the Connor's Curiosities shop, which is linked down in the description. But for now, let's get into the first entry. The Shell Grotto in Margate. Is a grotto full of shells located in Margate? Yeah, but no, in all seriousness, this grotto, cave system, underground living space or workshop space or whatever it was is absolutely insane. It has hallways, doors, arches, ornate designs, a huge dome, and much more. All covered basically every square inch in shells. And the best part, we have no idea when it was built, or who built it, or for what purpose. And it was originally, first, as far as we can tell, discovered in 1835, when a man named James Newlove and his son Joshua were just digging a pond in their garden, and they stumbled upon something. They didn't really know what it was, so they dug some more, they discovered more, and eventually, after more and more digging, they discovered the entire thing. They sent down excavators and explorers, and they eventually turned it into somewhat of a tourist attraction. You know, you would go down there, pay your penny or whatever cost it was, and you would get to see this massive shell grotto in its entirety. Now, as I said, we have no idea who built it or when they built it or why. There was a map drawn up in 1821, so 14 years before it was discovered, and this map contained properties, you know, houses, plots of land, buildings, basements, barns, sheds, etc., but made absolutely no mention of this grotto, so they clearly didn't know that it was there, nor can we find any earlier mention of this, or reference, or building plans, or anything. It's actually insane. Theories say that it might have been just like a secret project done by some rich guy, and I guess he built it in secret. He never really told anyone about it, he never published it, and so without any accounts of it, without any records or building plans, you know, as I said, it wasn't on any maps, we don't really know its origin. It likely was dug and built sometime around the 16th to 18th century, which I know is quite a wide time span, or some people say that it was like an ancient Roman temple, which would obviously put it a lot older than the 16th century, or some potential mining tunnels that, you know, someone discovered. They went down there, they cleaned them up, they decorated them with shells. There's honestly not a really good explanation for this. There are a bunch of like, kind of medium explanations, but overall, I absolutely love this one, and it looks incredibly beautiful. The Shirtwood Forest. Not the Sherwood Forest, which Google keeps bloody trying to correct me on, but the Shirtwood Forest is a forest or swamp just off Route 70 in New Jersey that has an obscene amount of white shirts just hanging all over the place, and nobody knows why they're there or who put them there or when. And the exact time that these shirts were put up, as I said, isn't exactly clear, but it was sometime around perhaps the 17th of October 1999 when 17 shirts were discovered, hung up, and the people who found this thought, that's a little strange, a little creepy, and a week went by, 2 weeks went by, even more shirts were put up, totaling now almost like 30 shirts just hung up around this forest. And yeah, perhaps one of the simplest, strangest, lightest mysteries on here. Very cool, mostly harmless, I would say, but that is the Shirtwood Forest. The Skid Row Stabber was a person, very likely a man, who killed up to 12 people, mostly homeless men, in just a short time, around 3 months, between 1978 and 1979. The first murder was on the 23rd of October 1978 of a man named Jesse Martinez. Then, around 6 days later, Jose Cortels was found dead. Then the next day, Bruce Emmett Drake, and this list of victims just goes on and on, but basically every few days another victim was found dead on the streets of Skid Row, with all of them being stabbed to death, and almost all of them having no witnesses, because there was one murder involved in this, the murder of David Jones, that actually had multiple witnesses, you know, a few of David's friends there at the time, and they were talking to a guy that went by the name of Luther, who they described as a black man in his 30s with a Puerto Rican accent, and then suddenly this Luther just stabbed David and fled the scene. 3 months later, an inscription that read, "My name is Luther, I kill winos and put them out of their misery," was found in the toilet of a nearby bus terminal. But I personally am not entirely sure how kind of reliable that is. You know, whether this was just someone messing with someone, maybe they heard about the name given to the police, you know, Luther, or maybe this was actually the killer himself, because as we all know, some killers just can't help talking, they can't help trying to get attention for themselves. But as far as suspects go, there was only really one serious suspect, and that was a man named Bobby Joe Maxwell. He was picked up in December of 1978 for the, and I quote, "deviant behavior against homeless people." And when he was picked up, they A, found a knife on him, and B, he was just kind of messing with, you know, the homeless people. So he was convicted of this. I don't think carrying a knife was illegal, but, you know, running by, knocking over the cups of homeless people, smacking them on the head, just being a general menace to them, that was illegal. So he was arrested for this. He did a few weeks in jail and then was released. But in these weeks that he was in jail, no murders happened. I mean, murders happened, you know, all around the world, all around the country, but I mean specifically these Skid Row murders stopped while he was in jail. And then, after he was released, 3 days later, the final victim, Luis Alvarez, was found stabbed to death. And so, with, you know, all of this somewhat circumstantial evidence, you know, he had a knife on him when he was found, he was messing with homeless people, the killings stopped while he was in jail, and the knife he had kind of matched the rough dimensions of the knife that was used on the victims. Because of all of this, police brought him in, you know, they arrested him again, but this time on suspicion of him being the Skid Row killer. He had his place searched, his belongings seized, you know, his knife and shoes, they took his shoe prints and fingerprints, they took his diary that he had, and from his diary, they were able to, you know, get these handwriting specialists to do sort of like a breakdown of his handwriting, and they attested in court that the handwriting that was found in the bathroom of the bus terminal, you know, the one that said "I am Luther and I kill winos," that this handwriting was similar enough to the handwriting in his diary for it to be a, you know, fairly relevant match. Then there was another man named Sidney Storch, who was the cellmate of Maxwell for around 3 weeks, roughly a year before the trial. And he said that Maxwell repeatedly claimed to have done all of these killings and apparently described them in detail that only the police and the killer would have had. So it seems like a pretty open and shut case, except that most of this evidence was really just circumstantial. You know, there was no DNA evidence of Maxwell at any of the scenes. There was no fingerprints of his on the bodies or hair samples or CCTV footage of, you know, him doing something. The witnesses who said that they could confirm that Maxwell was at one of these scenes later said that they really couldn't confirm it and that they just felt a lot of pressure from the prosecution and said, yeah, it was probably this guy, but then maybe the prosecution told them, look, you've got to be certain, you've got to say this is 100% absolutely this guy, otherwise you're going to let a guilty man, a murderer, go free. So this pressure was later found out to have been put on the witnesses. And Sidney Storch, the informant who, spent 3 weeks with Maxwell, he was later found out to be a habitual liar and would often give false testimony in exchange for, several benefits, maybe a better cell, maybe some commissary money, cigarettes, donuts, sort of thing. And Maxwell, who repeatedly through all of this, he always maintained his innocence, said he didn't kill anyone, he didn't attack anyone, and he would repeatedly file for appeals to have his case and his sentencing dismissed. Now, I know most guilty people probably do also say that they're innocent and they do file for appeals, but it's just to say that he was charged for these crimes and actually sentenced at the time to 30 years in prison for 2 of these Skid Row killings. So fast forward to 2010, almost 30 years later, and his sentencing was eventually overturned for, the reasons I gave earlier. The judge thought that there just wasn't enough evidence to actually convict him originally, so they granted him a new trial, which this new trial found him not guilty and basically completely exonerated him, which is fantastic, I suppose, except for the fact that he had a heart attack around 6 months before the trial, before the new trial. And due to this heart attack, he fell into a coma and stayed in this coma until his death just last year. So it's a bit of a weird one, honestly. There is, in my opinion, some evidence for sure that points to Maxwell being the killer, but is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Is it enough to convict a man for life? I'm not really so sure on that one. And a bunch of the witness testimonies were, they were flimsy, they were flaky, unreliable. The physical evidence is all circumstantial. There was, I guess, one piece of forensic evidence against him, which was one of his handprints on a bench near where one of the murders was found. But again, that is also circumstantial, because if he's spending all of his time, around Skid Row, he's hanging out there, he's sitting on benches and, messing with people. Like, I never said he was a good guy. He was, being cruel to these homeless people. So it's somewhat expected that maybe his handprint would be, on a bench somewhere. And he absolutely could have done these murders. I'm not saying he didn't, but most of the evidence was just circumstantial. So it's a wild case. Did he do these killings? Did he not do them? Was it someone else? Was it perhaps more than one person? Let me know your thoughts down below. And just real quick, guys, if you are enjoying the video and you want to support the channel, then please give me a hand and hit the subscribe button and the like button. And yeah, why not the bell icon while you're down there? Or just comment below what your favorite mystery is. I don't know, but anyway, on to the next entry. The Stewart Gardner Museum Heist. Heists. My favorite flavor of crime. But this took place in March of 1990, when 13 rare works of art were stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, and nobody was ever caught, and no pieces were ever found or recovered. And the heist started at around 1 in the morning on March 18th, when 2 police officers arrived at the museum saying that they were responding to a disturbance call, and told the security guards there that they just had to, pop in, take a quick look around, just make sure everything was above board, there was no heists or anything going on. And so they said their sergeant would, have a go at them if they didn't physically, see it with their own eyes. And so these museum guards said, all right, yeah, it's probably a false alarm, just take a look around, whatever. Except after being let into the museum, these officers revealed that they weren't really officers, but that they were heisters, in disguise, completely bamboozled. They handcuffed and restrained the museum security, and over the next hour or so, they proceeded to steal 13 works of art, totaling to over $500 million at least, because in today's money, that would be, worth even more. They also tend to go up in price if they are, more sought after or stolen for whatever reasons. So this heist could very well be worth, 750 million, maybe $1 billion. And I could honestly go on for days about all of the problems that this museum had, just in terms of security. And in fact, 8 years before this heist, the FBI actually uncovered a plot by certain people to rob this museum. So the museum found out about this, the FBI told them. They ended up putting in extra security. They put in some cameras, some footstep sensors. But because they were really, really lacking on funds as a museum, they had to be a bit kind of choosy about what they invested their security money on. So these cameras that they installed were only outside the museum. There was no cameras inside, but they did have inside, as I said, some motion sensors that could detect, human movement. And they also chose not to spend money on, some fancy schmancy communication technology. They didn't have any phones or form of communication kind of around the museum. They just had within the guard station a single panic button that would, set the alarms, contact the police, etc. And so when these heisters came in dressed as police, they didn't immediately just say, oh yeah, we're gonna heist the place. Like, they played it chill, they played it cool, they played the role of police officer well. They started making small talk with the museum guards. They actually kind of baited and lured one of the security guards out from behind the guard station, and I don't know how this actually worked, but they basically started to accuse one of these museum guards as fitting the description for a wanted criminal. So they just came into the museum, yeah, we're just going to take a look around, and then they were like, actually, you look like a robber or a murderer from, our database. And so the museum guard said, I'm not, obviously. And then the police heisters said, you'll have to prove that. Can we take a statement from you, with some of your details on, just so we can double check it back at the station? So, we won't have to arrest you, basically. And I guess the guard was like, fine, whatever. So he came out from behind the guard station, and he also put out a call to the other one who was at the time patrolling the museum for him to come back to the guard station as well. And then when they were both there outside of the guard station, these heisters basically, bonked them over the head, restrained them, tied them up, threatened their families if they, put up any resistance, or if they told anyone about who they were or what they were doing. And then with them restrained, they then went on to take all of these artworks. They got paintings down from the wall, they smashed the frames on the ground, they cut, in some cases, they cut the actual artwork, so, irreparably damaging them, basically. And in other cases, they just cut the kind of attachments on the edge. So the artwork itself was still intact, but experts have since said that if they had actually rolled these up, that this would also have damaged them, just because in the process of rolling, you can kind of snap some of the oil paints, perhaps. So they took a bunch of this art and they most likely damaged at least some of it. Then, after they were done, they went into the guard station. They took the only CCTV footage of them, that was taken from outside of the museum, pointing down into the doorway that they came through. And so the only reason or way that we have any idea what these, robbers actually looked like was from the eyewitness testimonies of the museum guards, but also of a few people outside. Almost immediately after this heist, the museum ended up offering $1 million as a reward for the return, or some information resulting in the return, of at least one of these pieces of work. But since then, no one has taken them up on it. So over the years, they have increased this bounty or reward even more, with it now sitting at a sweet $1 million reward for obviously the return of any of these artworks or information about where these pieces are that are worth at least $500 million. Someone did anonymously write in 1994, which was 4 years after the heist, and said that they would return these artworks if they were given a sweet $2.6 million and complete immunity. But the negotiations around this kind of dragged on a little bit. The FBI then got involved. I guess whoever wrote it in thought, it's getting a little risky. He didn't have immunity at the time, and so perhaps he thought if he kept messaging them, they would somehow find out where he is, find out where the artwork is, and then he would do a ton of prison time with no immunity. So because they cut off all contact, we still to this day don't know who these people were, where they went, where the artwork was stored, where it is now, if they even still exist to this day, the pieces of art, or if they were destroyed for some reason, getting rid of the evidence, burnt up, shredded, fed to crocodiles, what have you. And you can actually still visit this museum today, but since the artworks and the rooms and this whole museum was meant as a single project and a single collection, they thought it'd be a bit kind of weird and awkward to replace the artworks, with other paintings. And they also thought that it would take away from the collection if they just took the frames down. So what they ended up doing was leaving the frames up, or, putting them back up where they should have gone, leaving them empty, and so leaving the entire collection, the entire project still intact, just obviously missing the actual paintings for some of them. And in terms of trying to find a potential suspect for this, the investigators looked for people who perhaps didn't know too much about art, because the way in which these heisters, chose some of the art seemed to be quite random. They didn't take necessarily the most sought after or rare art. Yes, 1 or 2 pieces were, but as a whole they took, some very useful and worthwhile ones, and then some other ones which were kind of, they're just kind of normal paintings. Because on one hand, they took, for example, the Concert by Johannes Vermeer, which is thought now to be the most valuable painting ever stolen. So they successfully stole the most valuable painting of all time, but they also stole some relatively, kind of worthless pieces of art, worth maybe a few $1,000s, which is nothing compared to the millions of dollars that some of these were worth. So if they knew a bit about art, if they knew, what they were doing, they could have gone and pinpointed the most pricey art pieces, and perhaps, very likely, they would have gotten away with over $1 billion heist. But it seems like they just kind of got lucky with this pricey piece of art, and just, I guess, decided to take a few that looked nice, maybe some big ones. Maybe they thought, oh, that's probably worth a lot of money, got paint on it. And so in terms of suspects, they weren't really looking too deeply into individual people. A lot of the focus and a lot of these suspects were from organized crime, so gangs, mafia sort of thing. And one of the main organized groups, organized crime gangs, was from Massachusetts. And goddamn, that just appears in every single one of my videos. I cannot escape the Massachusetts curse. But they did, get some kind of rumors and whispers and kind of testimony that, oh, I knew a guy who knew a guy whose brother said he was involved in this heist or something, and most of this was within the organized crime gangs. But also, most of these culprits, most of the people they say were involved, or perhaps had organized this, or, was the driver for the heist, or in fact was one of the actual fake policemen. A lot of those people have since died over the years, and still none of the artworks have turned up. So sadly, I think the odds of us retrieving any of these, priceless, or I guess there is a price on some of them, but any of these rare, incredibly unique, beautiful pieces of art is probably quite low. But as I said, I do always love a good heist, and maybe I'll do a heist iceberg sometime in the future. Suzanne Lyall was a 19-year-old girl who went missing from Albany, New York in 1998, and Suzanne had just finished her shift at Babbage's, which was a place where she worked, basically like an old computer or gaming store. She closed the store, she boarded the bus, the one that she regularly got from her work, going back to her university's campus. And we know roughly her movements at this time because a classmate said that they saw her, they witnessed her getting off this bus at around 9 o'clock at night. And despite the bus stop only being like really a short distance away from her dorm, Suzanne was sadly never seen again. The next morning, Suzanne's boyfriend called Suzanne's parents, asking if they had seen her, if they had heard from her, as he said she hadn't returned from last night, and he or any of his friends just hadn't heard from her. So the parents then contacted the campus police. They checked on her room. They found Suzanne's belongings, like, her glasses, her hairdryer left on the bed. It didn't look like Suzanne had run away. She hadn't packed anything, any of her essentials, any clothes. And the campus police at the time suggested just kind of waiting a little while, before officially reporting her to the police as missing. As they said, this is university, she's a college kid, AWOLs among college students, university students are quite common. And so the parents kind of reluctantly waited just a little bit. Then, and this wouldn't be found out until, a few days later, but on the day that they figured out that she was missing, in the afternoon, there was $20 taken out of an ATM using Suzanne's card. And this ATM was near campus, and apparently, according to Suzanne's boyfriend, only Suzanne herself and her boyfriend knew the PIN code to this card. And the next day, with Suzanne still not turning up, and with her missing all of her classes, even a midterm exam that she had scheduled, it was then that the campus police went, okay, this is clearly unusual. So they then called the real police and they reported her missing. They did searches of the campus, nothing turned up. They put posters and flyers out and around. They conducted a few interviews with some classmates, perhaps people that had seen her get off the bus, but nothing substantial surfaced. And Suzanne's boyfriend at the time, Richard Condon, who was obviously a suspect at the time, because as you know from these sorts of cases, it is normally, family members or significant others. And the fact that he was, one of the only people with the PIN to Suzanne's bank card made him clearly a prime suspect. But there was one problem with that, in that he seemed to have a completely solid alibi for the entire evening and night. And that was that he was basically playing video games with a friend all, afternoon, all throughout the evening, deep into the night, and he was there the entire time. His friend attested to this, and so unless his friend is just completely lying, which that is always a possibility, this meant that the boyfriend was seemingly innocent. And strangely, that's about as far as the investigation went. There was no real super motives for this outside of someone just kidnapping Suzanne, but it's not like she was a political figure and so there was a giant motive, or like she was a business owner or had wealth somewhere or had some sort of a life insurance policy. She had no real enemies. She was just a smart, nerdy kid in school, just working away, doing her classes, taking her exams. There seems to be no real motive outside of someone just, doing a crime of opportunity. They see a girl on her own, walking alone, and that is, I think, in my opinion, very likely what happened. But months later, after basically no updates, no clues, no discoveries, nothing, there was a single clue found, and that was Suzanne's name tag that she wore at work and that she would have been wearing on the night that she disappeared, and this was found in the parking lot near the bus stop that she was last seen at. And by the looks of it, it was, old, beaten, dirty, cracked. So the investigators surmised that it had probably fallen off for some reason that night and had remained on the floor and was, driven over multiple times, cracking it, damaging it, but that they couldn't really get any DNA from it. There was no clues, no, anything like that. And so as far as the timeline goes, it seems very, very likely that Suzanne did get on that bus that night, and she made her entire journey without, incident. She got off at this particular bus stop, but from there, we don't really know exactly what happened. The name tag itself was found in the opposite direction she would have had to walk if she were, going straight back to her dorm. So it's hard to say why Suzanne walked the other way. Did she meet someone at the bus stop that she knew, perhaps? And they were like, oh yeah, come, let's just grab a late night milkshake or something. And so she walked with them before being abducted. Or did someone lie to her and say, hey, I'm the father of one of your friends, can you come over here for a second, I've got something to show you? Or was she perhaps going somewhere on her own before she went back to her dorm? Maybe she wanted to take a walk around, maybe she was meeting someone that we don't know, maybe she decided to visit a shop or something on the other side, as the bus stop itself was somewhat public, and it is possible that whoever attacked her could have been on the bus, or they could have been at the bus stop waiting for her, and then as soon as she got off, as soon as the bus drove away, they maybe pulled out a knife, threatened her, and so she went with them the opposite way of her dorm. And so that's the theory surrounding that. But the other strange thing is that, as I said, she withdrew $20 from an ATM just the next morning or, afternoon. And we know that it was very likely her because only she and her boyfriend knew the PIN, and her boyfriend seemingly had a solid alibi, for the night that she went missing and for the next day. And so it's like you have these two theories that neither of them really line up properly. If she did run away, then she might have taken out money herself. But in that case, why wouldn't she take out more money? And why wouldn't she leave, at a normal time, run away from home, pack her bags, that sort of thing? And if she was abducted, why would the killer only withdraw $20? Like, surely he would say, oh, yeah, I need some money, take out 100 or 200 from your bank account. Like, why risk there being cameras around there? You can potentially get caught, all just for $20. Unless maybe it's like a strange combination of the two, where she was abducted, but the abductor made her take out only $20, to make it look like she ran away and she was the one withdrawing it. So I'm not really sure on all of that. So a very strange case overall, a very tragic one as well, I would say. It's very unlikely that she made it back to her dorm on that night. As I said, the most likely scenario is that she was taken somehow from the bus stop, and sadly, to this day, there's no further evidence, and we don't know what happened to Suzanne on that night, or if she is even still alive, or whether she will ever be found. And reading into, the life of Suzanne, how she was as a person, as a student, she seemed like a very good kid, a very smart kid. She was working in a computer store, and so she loved all of this, putting bits and bobs together, electrical science or whatever it's called, building computers, programming them. She was a massive nerd in, the best of ways, and was someone who seemed to be truly, going somewhere, destined for greatness, but her destiny was apparently cut short by whatever monster it was that ended up taking her. Puke Thunder is an interesting one, to say the least, but it is or was a truly amazing, legendary, powerful strain of the devil's cabbage, the old wacky tobacco, the green giant, the bearded bud, the Mary Jane. It was that. But this strain was a particular strain that originated in Puke, New Zealand. This was in the 1970s, and it was said to be incredibly potent, incredibly high quality and satisfying, and it spread and grew in popularity for these reasons. Firstly across New Zealand, then soon across the entire world, but eventually, for whatever reason, it was apparently smoked out of existence, driven to extinction, and is now thought to be purely a thing of myth and legend, with no seeds or buds surviving to this day. And so there is apparently an urgent call to anyone who has any of these or has access to any of them to, start growing it more, to maybe send it into a production area. I don't know the terms for it, but basically to bring it back from extinction so the people can use it and appreciate it all over the world. Teraphim is a simple one, but still a mysterious one. And these are these things, very likely idols or medium-sized statues or what have you, mentioned in the Bible a few times, but we're not entirely sure exactly what they were. They were theorized to represent like small household or family gods, or to connect a person, whoever it was, to their family or to their ancestors, and they weren't able to be legally transferred out of the family and could only change legal possession through familial inheritance. Meaning these were insanely important. If it was in your family possession, you couldn't just get a super rich person just going around and buying all of these. Like, they had to legally stay within the family. They were thought to kind of channel, the souls or emotions or blessings or whatever of your ancestors. And I think it's a very, very cool thing. But as I said, we're not exactly sure what they were. And this was all, in the time of the Bible, in the Old Testament, which was a time where Yahweh seemed to be, a or the dominant god, but he wasn't the only god. Households seemed to have minor family gods. Even towns and villages had their own, god of the river, god of the mountain or the hill or whatever. Other tribes even had their own gods. Heck, even Hebrews in the early days of their religion had many gods, not just Yahweh, with Yahweh even having his own wife. But that was in the early days, and that is a super interesting story, but for another day. The Jester is the pseudonym of a guy or gal who is what is known as a grey hat hacker, which is someone that is sort of like chaotic neutral, I suppose. They mostly stay within the law, they mostly perform moral hacks, but they're a bit shady. Their identities sometimes aren't known, sometimes they do, minorly break the law, but that was what Jester was classified as. And this Jester was known since around 2010. He said, or at least he was rumored to be ex-military, having apparently served in Afghanistan, and was known in general for going after anti-American companies or going after Islamic jihadist websites, like the Taliban's official website in 2010, which I didn't even know they had an official website. That's just insane. As well as, for example, the Westboro Baptist Church, after they celebrated the death of a gay military serviceman. But even though the Jester has been somewhat active, somewhat vocal over the years, we still to this day don't know their official identity. The tomb of Antony and Cleopatra. Ancient Rome. My favorite flavor of ice cream. Time period. But a quick history lesson for those who don't know. We have Julius Caesar, very powerful man, took over Rome, married Cleopatra, more or less united Egypt and Rome, as, Cleopatra became the queen of Rome. So, big success, happy family. Then Julius Caesar gets assassinated, et tu, Brute. Am I using that right? So Cleopatra is lost, kind of confused. She decides for her own safety and security and that of her family to basically marry another powerful man, that being Mark Antony. And so then in the power vacuum of Julius Caesar's death, there ended up being a massive war for power in Rome, with Mark Antony being one of these contesters. But eventually, when Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's great nephew, he ended up basically winning this war and killing Mark and Cleopatra. Now, apparently he didn't kill them directly, he just destroyed them, destroyed their armies, made them surrender, and in some stories allowed them to choose their own death. And that's where the famous act of, Cleopatra choosing to die by snake poison. So I think there's some really cool paintings, images, depictions of this, with her just lying there and just snakes attacking her. But this entire mystery of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's tomb, where they were both buried in the end, is something that was never really solved. We think due to historical accounts like, for example, Plutarch, and some geographical and archaeological theories, that it might potentially reside somewhere around or on the island of Antirodos, and I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. I'm still not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, but this was a small island roughly nearby where Antony lived, at least while in Egypt, and near Cleopatra's palace, which due to an earthquake currently resides at the bottom of the ocean. So very cool. If I'll show you some photos of the finds down there. Very cool place to explore, I think. There's something always a little eerie, a little creepy with like above water things like statues and temples and everyday items being discovered in this underwater tomb sort of place. Very strange, very eerie, but this is thought likely to be the location of the tomb. As I said, we don't officially know, as the tomb itself has never been discovered or found, but that is at least our best guess so far. The Tribec Disappearances is one hell of a mysterious case, and it involves the disappearances of many people in the Tribec Mountains in Slovakia, also sometimes referred to as the Slovak Bermuda Triangle. And this case takes us all the way back to 1929, when the first person, named Stefan Samsely, disappeared during a snowstorm, which, okay, there's nothing unusual so far. Could just be, nature. People disappear all the time in snowstorms. Then the following year, 18-year-old Maria, and I'm gonna have one hell of a time pronouncing this name, but it is Maria Shvajarova, but she disappeared while she was out running an errand, and she was never found. Then there was Walter Fisher in 1939, who didn't die, but went out hiking, then completely disappeared, completely went missing, and turned up 3 months later, unconscious with multiple burn marks on his body, and he couldn't recall where he had been or what had happened to him. So he ended up just going completely crazy and eventually dying in a mental asylum. Yeah. Then the body of a girl that no one knew was found around here, and where she had come from, who she was, or how she died, nobody knew. And there are just loads of these. There was a couple that went missing and were never found, and strangely in this one, their car ended up, turning up. Someone found their car, but it was abandoned with the doors open, but with no sign of the couple. Then in the 1980s, Antonin Topil went missing, and this was from his nearby village, and once again he was never found. Then there was Jan Seiler, who once again went missing, and also once again they found their car by the side of the road abandoned with the valuables still inside, which kind of throws the whole, robbery theory out the window. And finally, Jaroslav Boransky was out mushroom hunting. When he went missing, he never returned home, and he was never found. So a lot of missing people, a lot of strange cases in these mountains, some that have gone missing and ended up turning up, and some who they themselves went missing, but their cars were then found abandoned, and in that one strange case with the doors still open. And for this one, it's like, yeah, okay, maybe if they're in the mountains, walking home in a snowstorm, like, you don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out that, maybe what could have happened there. But there are quite a few others that, maybe it's a little more suspect, maybe it's a little more strange. And as you can imagine, the theories on this one range, quite widely. From them just getting lost in the wilderness, falling off a cliff, falling into a river, being eaten by bears or something, to a serial killer, or a hunter who finds these people in the middle of nowhere and ends up, killing and taking them. Or, obviously, aliens abducting them, especially for that one who went missing for like 3 months, didn't know where he had been, ended up going crazy. Or there's some theories about, government projects, secret agent kills, KGB sort of thing, of people heading out into the wilderness and finding or seeing something that they shouldn't have seen. As Some of these around the kind of Cold War era. There was a lot of crazy stuff back then. But these cases honestly remind me a little bit of the Dyatlov Pass case, which is insanely fascinating. It was one of the first cases that I covered ever on this channel, and I really do think that I should, you know, redo the video, have like an updated version, you know, new research, new stylish lighting in the background. But until I make that video, just a little kind of spoiler, kind of a preview for a few videos time. I will also be covering one of the unsolved mysteries specifically from that case. But for these disappearances in particular, I will leave a full documentary down below. So feel free to check it out, learn a bit about the case, and let me know what you think happened to a lot of these people in the comments down below. And that is all we have time for. This is a tiny bit of a shorter video this time around. I'm trying to get out this, you know, entire tier once and for all, which I think there's 2 more videos left in this tier. So once those come out, the unique icebergs will start rolling out. We've got the archaeological one coming up, the SCP iceberg, the cruel and unusual leaders. We've also got a few wars that we're covering, you know, Vietnam, World War II, the Cold War. So some very, very cool stuff coming up. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.